and good evening. It's May 28th, 2024, and we're in our next collection of discussions in our Outside the Class series. This is a series from the Bible Project, and it's about the entire TaNaK, the entire Old Testament. On TheDustyFeet.com, in the Outside the Class section, we have the TaNaK, or Old Testament source video section, set up for your review. Because the intent of Outside the Class is for you to listen to the in-class lecture first. They would, of course, be found in the source video playlist. We're still going to try to keep these to around 15 to 20 minutes or so, because we want to make them easy to catch and easier to catch up on. So we're beginning our scroll by scroll, our book by book journey through this collection, but with a fun and different twist on Outside the Class on the Dusty Feet. And before we forget, if you do find these kinds of podcasts useful, that's when you click that subscribe button. The reminders, they just help you. But also, you think these might be useful to others, that's when you click that like button, because that is the way that YouTube chooses to share these to more people, if they wish. So, in this series, we're going to be covering the entire TaNaK, right? The entire Old Testament. Yet, we're going to be doing it in the original order of this collection, right? The Hebrew Scriptures order. So this could really get interesting after we get past the first five. So, TaNaK, the Old Testament, the overview. As we begin this series, I kind of want to remind us that there's probably going to be more questions than there are answers, at least in the ratio of questions to answers. I mean, we will try to respond to some of the information, but as we discuss it, I'm going to leave it up to you if it's really an answer. But I think there's going to be a lot of questions we're going to be asking about all kinds of things, of where actually we're not going to get, or we're not going to know an answer. It is what it is. I'm going to start with this one. Do you remember when Tim first introduced this series, and he's talking about this collection of scrolls that we have in our Bibles today that we call the Old Testament, and that they're in a particular order. And he says that was not the original order found in the Hebrew Scriptures. That's where we get TaNaK, right? Spelled here. And that's basically, in there we have the Torah, then the prophets, then the writings. We'll get there. So one of the questions that hit me from the start, why? As in, why did it later, and as Tim put it, did Christian tradition change the original order of the Hebrew Scriptures? At least to the order that we have in our traditional Western Church Bibles. So again, see, I don't think this is a question we're going to get an answer to. It's just that somebody, or rather more likely a group of somebodies, like a group of scribes and prophets that grouped the original collection together, they decided to change it. It's a little bit uncomfortable for me, because at times I wonder what the motivation was. You know, I do have my own thoughts on that, but I think we're going to leave that for a different discussion. But I want to do in this particular series, and I appreciate this introduction to let us do that, is I'm just going to cover every scroll or every book in this series. I'm just going to do it in the original order. And we're going to get to enjoy each of those little topics that Tim brings up still to help us have a wider view of each of the collections. And maybe even a few things that Tim doesn't talk about. Because the Bible Project, they're going to have an overview, and you will only get all of their context thoughts by listening to each one. That's the in-class lecture, right? That's in the source video playlist. Because then from there, we can build. From there, we can launch into questions that we're going to have about each one. Maybe get a chance to expound on a few other points of interest as well. But here's our fun. we're going to do it in the order of the TaNaK. We're going to study each of these videos in the order of the original Hebrew scriptures. Because we're going to begin with Genesis and the Torah. Then we're going to end with Chronicles. But maybe we're going to understand why Chronicles was, and probably should be, at the end. So the intro, of course, it takes us to the three main sections, the Torah, the Nevi'im, the Ketuvim, yeah? Okay. The TaNaK. Those are the three main sections. Yet actually, here's a fun little scroll history fact. There's still three sections, but they're actually broken into, there's actually 16 scrolls. Back in a synagogue, there would actually be 16 scrolls. And in each is a story to be seen as a story that maybe needed its own scroll. I don't know. So scroll 1 is the Torah, those first 5 pieces, right? There are actually 5 sections that are all stitched into one. Scroll 2 is Joshua. Scroll 3, Judges. Scroll 4 is Samuel. We have 1st and 2nd Samuel in our Bibles, but it's just one. Scroll of Samuel. Scroll 5, we have Kings. Again, we have 1st and 2nd Kings, but for them, just one scroll, Kings. Scroll 6, Isaiah. Scroll 7, Jeremiah. Scroll 8, that's a scroll of Ezekiel. Scroll 9 is the scroll of the 12 prophets. In there is Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Scroll 10 is the Psalms. Scroll 11 are the Proverbs. Scroll 12, it's a small scroll. It's Job. Scroll 13 is the 5 Megalot, right? In there are the Song of Songs. We call it the Song of Solomon, along with Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. Then scroll 14, Daniel. Scroll 15, Ezra and Nehemiah. And if you remember in our last series, we had Ezra and Nehemiah were together on a platform at the Watergate. So I'm really not surprised they're together here. And the final scroll, scroll 16, the Chronicles. Again, we have 1st and 2nd, just one scroll here. So these 16 scrolls compose the entire TaNaK. It's interesting. I like how Tim put it, that these were put together by scribes and prophets. And it's the mission of these scribes and prophets, these unnamed group of people, that they were spirit-led, guided and gifted by God. Not only to write these orally passed down stories, but to put them together with, as we will see, such design and purpose. If you choose to look, we might actually see the handiwork of God. Because remember, we're eventually going to talk about the Brit, or the New Testament, the Brit Hadashah. I just wonder if anything like this is going to show up there. But right now, we're talking about the TaNaK, and how these people and how they chose to stitch these scrolls together, these stories, again, that were orally passed down from generation to generation, and eventually they were penned on parchment. And this bears out in the Dead Sea Scrolls, right, which were found again, the late 40s, early 50s, by a shepherd boy? So not far before my lifetime anyways. But it's more of a glimpse than ever into not only those scrolls, but also other scrolls, those known by the surrounding community, yet they didn't find their way into the TaNaK. Because remember, there are others that were part of the discussions that we see in Scripture. They just didn't make it into that TaNaK, the Old Testament. But they're still very much a part of the discussion in Jewish history. we have Enoch, the Maccabees, Jubilee, others, right? Very influential at times in history, just not part of TaNaK. And there's that sub-question that gets asked, and Tim brought it up, loved it, was the phrase, guided by God's Spirit. I love the term, that these people were guided by God's Spirit to put these stories together. Did you catch the subtle point I made? To put these stories together? Because the stories existed. These have been orally passed down again for many generations. And at some time they became what we today, we just call the Old Testament. I think we're very comfortable with saying that God's Spirit was used in, the major prophets or the beautiful writings of King David. I just hope we can now allow it to be seen in the work of collecting these stories into scrolls. Because this is how God is telling the story of his interaction and his relationship, first with all of humanity, then narrowing it down to his chosen, right? The children of Israel. We will for sure have that as a context as we dive underneath the surface at times. We've used this term in the past. It's called tip of the iceberg, right? We do that a lot because when we start with something, then we end up finding out there's really much more underneath. And all the interactions that God has had with his people, what's really captured and actually written down in the scriptures themselves, I think it's just a tip of the iceberg of his interactions. I mean, one could call them, maybe these are the highlights, maybe sometimes the lowlights, but all of them are of his interactions with us, his expectations with us, the good and the not so good. Because except for the tablets, which we have given directly to Moshe, right? Given directly to Moses, the rest of this is all written down by human hand. They're just collections. Yeah, so this makes it interesting. Because it does not say that these folks were in a trance and they penned these books. They are recalling the stories, capturing the important events in the Jewish people's history. Somebody is writing that story down. It's being condensed to eventually become a scroll that we have the benefit of hearing or the benefit of reading. I don't doubt the fullness of the story. I just remember that in all of the lives lived, just that small section of history, that's really just the tip of an iceberg. One could say that we've lost to memory more about the interactions of God with his people than we actually have recorded. We only see a little bit. And I think we need to remember that as we live our lives each day, that we are a part of, like their lives were being lived out as an example. Our little bits. Another scroll in the story of God and his people. Because I believe we're part of this story. So I wonder what folks will think when they look back on our scrolls or our books. In this story, will we look like we belong or not? It's going to be nice to have this series on the Dusty Feet because it is going to help us sure to look and remember. Next week, we're going to continue with this. We're going to be opening the Torah. Let me start in Genesis. Bereshit. So, thanks for with us tonight as we start our new series, TaNaK, the Old Testament, on Outside the Class, on the Dusty Feet.